Sometimes the smallest places are where the biggest mistakes happen. At 7:12 on a cool Tuesday morning, Reed's Corner Bakery smelled like warm cinnamon, fresh bread, and the quiet promise of a good day. The shop sat on the corner of a narrow street where delivery trucks rolled past slowly and office workers stopped in before their commute downtown. The sign above the door was a little faded, the windows a little old, but inside the place carried the kind of warmth that didn't come from the ovens alone. Marcus Reed stood behind the wooden counter, tying the strings of his apron while the early sunlight stretched across trays of golden pastries. At 6'2", with calm eyes and flour dusted lightly across his dark hands, Marcus moved through the small bakery with the steady rhythm of someone who had done the same work for many years. He checked the temperature of the oven, brushed crumbs from the display case, and set aside a small chocolate croissant on a napkin near the register. That one wasn't for sale. It was for Lila. In the back corner, his 8-year-old daughter sat on a stool swinging her sneakers gently above the floor while she worked through a page of math homework. Every few seconds, she looked up, watching her father the way children watch the person who makes their world feel safe. Outside, the city was already rushing somewhere important, but inside the bakery time moved differently. A retired mailman read the newspaper near the window. A nurse in blue scrubs sipped coffee before her shift. Marcus greeted each customer the same way, with a small nod and a calm voice that felt genuine instead of rehearsed. He believed simple things mattered. A warm loaf of bread, a polite word, remembering someone's usual order. The bell above the door chimed again at 7:34, and a gust of cool air followed a woman who stepped inside quickly, her phone still pressed to her ear. Her heels clicked sharply against the tile floor, and even before anyone recognized her, the energy in the room shifted slightly. Victoria Hale was used to walking into rooms where decisions worth millions of dollars were waiting for her. As CEO of Hale Nutritional Foods, her schedule was measured in meetings, flights, and negotiations that rarely paused long enough for something as ordinary as breakfast. Today had already started badly. 3 missed calls, 2 urgent emails, a problem with a distribution contract that could affect half the company's quarterly numbers. She ended the call with a quiet but tense, "Handle it," and slipped the phone into her coat pocket while scanning the small bakery like someone who had accidentally stepped into the wrong building. Marcus noticed her immediately, not because of the expensive coat or the sharp confidence in the way she stood, but because people carrying that much pressure always seemed a little out of place in peaceful rooms. He offered the same gentle nod he gave everyone else. "Morning," he said calmly. "What can I get started for you?" Victoria barely looked up from her thoughts as she stepped toward the counter. Outside, traffic moved past the quiet bakery like any other morning in the city. Inside, without anyone realizing it yet, the next few minutes were about to change far more than a simple breakfast order. Victoria Hale stood at the counter with the quiet impatience of someone who measured time differently than everyone else in the room. Her fingers tapped lightly against the polished wood while her eyes moved across the display case without really seeing what was inside. Croissants, blueberry muffins, cinnamon rolls, loaves of sourdough cooling on a rack behind the counter. To most people it looked comforting. To her it looked slow. Marcus Reed waited without rushing her. He had seen this kind of energy before. People who carried too many decisions before breakfast often walked into the bakery like storms looking for somewhere to land. "Coffee," she said finally, her voice clear but distracted. "Black, 12 ounces. Marcus nodded once and turned toward the espresso machine. The quiet hiss of steam filled the space as he prepared the cup. Behind him, Lila watched the woman curiously from her stool, her pencil resting against the open workbook on her lap. She noticed the expensive watch on the woman's wrist and the way her phone lit up again almost immediately in her coat pocket. Marcus placed the coffee on the counter gently. "Careful," he said. "It is hot." Victoria reached for it while glancing at the message that had just appeared on her screen. Another update about the contract issue that had been following her since sunrise. Her jaw tightened slightly as she read the words. Numbers. Delays. Complications. She took a sip of the coffee without really tasting it. Marcus studied the register briefly before speaking again in his calm, steady tone. "That will be $3.80. Victoria slid a card across the counter without looking up. The machine took a moment longer than usual to process the payment. It was a small pause, barely noticeable, But in a mind already overloaded with pressure, it felt like another obstacle in a day that refused to cooperate. Victoria exhaled slowly and rubbed her temple. Marcus noticed the tension in her shoulders and spoke again, not as a correction but as simple conversation. Mornings can be heavy sometimes, he said quietly. Coffee helps a little. Bread helps more. Lila smiled faintly from her stool because she had heard her father say that same line many times before. But Victoria heard it differently. Her eyes lifted from the phone for the first time and met Marcus's calm expression. In her mind, already crowded with stress and unfinished problems, the sentence landed in the wrong place. It sounded less like kindness and more like a comment about the way she looked standing there in an expensive coat with frustration written all over her face. The kind of comment people sometimes make when they think they are being clever. Victoria straightened slightly. "Excuse me," she said, the word cool and sharp enough that the nurse by the window lowered her coffee cup slowly. Marcus blinked once, not defensive, only surprised by the sudden change in tone. "Just saying breakfast can make a morning easier," he replied gently. Victoria looked around the small bakery again, this time seeing something different in the quiet room. She saw the simple tables, the old tile floor, the man in an apron speaking to her as if he understood the kind of pressure she was under. And something inside her, stretched thin from 100 other frustrations, tightened one step further. The phone in her pocket buzzed again. Another message. Another problem waiting outside that door. For a moment she stood there between the smell of warm bread and the noise of a world that never slowed down, and the distance between those two worlds suddenly felt much larger than a cup of coffee on a wooden counter. Victoria Hale held the warm cup of coffee in her hand, but did not drink from it again. The silence in the bakery had changed. It was still quiet, but it was no longer comfortable. It felt watchful. The nurse by the window pretended to read a message on her phone. The retired mailman slowly folded his newspaper, his eyes drifting toward the counter without turning his head. Marcus Reed remained exactly where he had been a moment before, calm behind the register, his hands resting lightly on the wooden surface as if nothing unusual had happened. But Victoria could still hear the sentence in her mind. Breakfast can make a morning easier. The words sounded simple, yet in the tension of her morning they landed like a suggestion she did not need. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "Are you trying to tell me how to manage my morning?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, confusion passing across his face for a brief second before it settled back into the same steady calm. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "Just offering bread if you wanted something to eat with the coffee." The answer was polite, measured, and completely sincere. But Victoria was already carrying too much frustration to hear sincerity clearly. Her phone vibrated again. Another message from her operations director asking for an immediate decision on the contract delay. Her chest tightened. She slipped the phone out, read the message, then slid it back into her coat with a controlled breath that did not quite hide her irritation. "I asked for coffee," she said. Not commentary. The words were not loud, but they carried through the small room with enough weight that Lila slowly lowered her pencil. Marcus did not react with offense. He simply nodded once, the way someone does when they recognize a storm that does not belong to them. "Understood," he said gently. "Coffee only." For a moment, it looked like the moment might pass. Victoria reached for her card again, intending to take the cup and leave the quiet bakery behind. But as she turned slightly, her elbow brushed the edge of the counter. The cup tipped. Coffee spilled across the wood and onto the polished floor in a dark, spreading shape. It was not dramatic. It was not loud. Just a simple accident. But accidents have a way of becoming something else when a person is already standing on the edge of patience. Victoria stepped back sharply, the frustration of the entire morning rising in a sudden wave. "Seriously?" she muttered under her breath. Marcus immediately grabbed a towel from beneath the counter and began wiping the spill before it reached the floor mat near Lila's stool. "It is okay," he said calmly. "It happens all the time." He moved with quiet efficiency, careful and unhurried, the same way he handled every small problem in the bakery. But the calmness only made Victoria feel more out of place, like the only person in the room whose world was moving too fast. "No," she said, shaking her head slightly as if arguing with the moment itself. "Nothing today is simple." Her voice rose just enough that the nurse glanced over again. Marcus finished wiping the counter and placed a fresh cup on the surface without charging her for another one. "Here," he said. New cup. No problem. Victoria stared at the cup for a second. Something about the gesture, the quiet patience, the way he acted as if the entire situation was nothing important, pushed the tension in her chest one step further than it had been all morning. She did not see the kindness in the act. She saw someone dismissing the seriousness of her day. Her hand rested on the counter, fingers tightening slightly against the wood as the calm bakery suddenly felt smaller than it had a few minutes earlier, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the pressure she had been trying to hold together since sunrise. Marcus Reed noticed the shift immediately. Years of running a small bakery had taught him how quickly a quiet room could change when someone walked in carrying too much weight on their shoulders. Victoria Hale was no longer just frustrated. She was cornered by her own mourning, and the calm inside the bakery was beginning to feel like the wrong place for someone moving at the speed of boardrooms and contracts. Marcus lifted the towel from the counter and folded it slowly, placing it beside the register as if the moment were already finished. "You do not have to worry about it," he said in the same steady tone. "Coffee spills. It is just coffee." Victoria stared at the fresh cup sitting in front of her. The steam curled upward in a quiet line. The smell was warm and simple, but her mind was still racing through numbers, calls, and decisions waiting across the city. The calmness of the man behind the counter felt almost unreal, like a different world that refused to acknowledge the one she lived in. "You keep saying that," she replied, her voice tightening. "Like everything is just small and simple." Marcus did not immediately answer. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the corner where Lila sat on her stool. She had stopped writing completely now, her eyes moving between the woman at the counter and her father. Marcus turned back to Victoria with the same composed expression. "Most things are," he said quietly. "People forget that sometimes." The sentence landed harder than the others. Victoria let out a short breath that was almost a laugh, but carried no humor. "You think this is simple?" she asked. Her hand gestured vaguely toward the room, the counter, the slow, peaceful rhythm of the bakery. "Standing here talking about bread while the rest of the world is trying to solve real problems?" The retired mailman shifted slightly in his chair, but said nothing. Marcus remained still, his hands resting loosely on the counter, as if the conversation were simply another part of the morning routine. "Everyone has real problems," he answered. "Some people just handle them differently." Victoria felt the words like a quiet push against the tension she had been holding together since dawn. Her phone vibrated again in her pocket, persistent and demanding, reminding her that outside this small shop a dozen people were waiting for decisions only she could make. In that moment, the bakery felt too slow, too calm, too removed from the urgency that defined her life. She reached for the cup again, but did not drink from it. Instead, she set it back down with a sharper movement than she intended. The coffee rippled inside the cup. "You have no idea what kind of pressure people deal with outside this place," she said. Marcus looked at her carefully, not with judgment, but with the quiet attention of someone who had spent years listening more than speaking. "Maybe not the same kind," he replied gently. "But pressure is still pressure." The simplicity of the response made the air feel heavier instead of lighter. Victoria stepped back slightly from the counter, the heels of her shoes echoing softly against the tile floor. For a second it looked as if she might simply walk out and leave the conversation behind. But the frustration that had followed her all morning refused to let the moment go. She looked around the bakery again, at the trays of bread, the quiet customers, the man who refused to react the way most people did when she spoke sharply. And something inside her patience finally slipped. Not into chaos, not into anything dramatic, but into the kind of controlled anger that powerful people often carry when they believe they are not being taken seriously. The calm room held its breath as Victoria Hale placed both hands on the edge of the counter, leaning forward slightly toward Marcus Reed, the warmth of the untouched coffee rising between them, while the quiet bakery waited to see what would happen next. Victoria Hale leaned forward slightly over the wooden counter, her hands resting firmly against the smooth surface as if the quiet bakery itself had suddenly become part of the argument building in her chest. Marcus Reed did not step back. He simply stood there, steady and calm, the same way he had stood through hundreds of rushed mornings and tired customers over the years. The difference now was the silence spreading through the room. The retired mailman had completely lowered his newspaper. The nurse near the window held her coffee without drinking it. Even the soft hum of the refrigerator behind the counter seemed louder than before. Victoria exhaled slowly, trying to gather control over the frustration that had followed her since sunrise. But the effort only made the tension sharper. "You talk like everything in the world can be solved with bread and patience," she said, her voice tight, but controlled. "That might work here, but outside this place people are dealing with real consequences." Marcus listened without interruption. His eyes did not show anger, only attention. He folded the towel once more and set it beside the register before answering. "I am not trying to solve the world," he said quietly. "Just trying to take care of the people who walk through that door." Victoria let out a short breath again, shaking her head as if the simplicity of the answer made the entire conversation feel even more frustrating. Her phone vibrated once more in her pocket. She ignored it this time. For a moment the two of them stood there separated by nothing more than a cup of coffee, and two completely different ways of looking at life. Then Victoria reached for her wallet with a quick motion and pulled out several bills. She placed them on the counter beside the cup. The money was far more than the cost of the drink. "Keep it," she said, "for the mess." Marcus glanced down at the bills and then back up at her face. "That is not necessary," he replied calmly. "It was an accident." But Victoria was already shaking her head. "No," she said, her voice firm now. "You keep saying that like none of this matters." Her hand moved across the counter in a sudden, frustrated motion, sliding the cup aside as she pushed the money closer to him. The cup tipped slightly, spilling a thin line of coffee across the polished wood again before Marcus quickly steadied it. The movement was small, but it carried enough tension to make Lila stand up from her stool in the corner. Marcus noticed immediately. His eyes shifted briefly toward his daughter and then back to Victoria. The calm in his voice deepened just a little. "Ma'am," he said gently, "it is all right. We will clean it up." Victoria followed his glance for the first time and noticed the little girl standing quietly near the back wall. The sight gave her pause for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the tension in the room to soften slightly. But the pause did not last. The pressure of the morning was still there, pressing against every second she remained in this small, quiet place. She straightened her posture, adjusting the sleeve of her coat as if preparing to leave. "You should learn something," she said, her tone no longer raised but still edged with frustration. "Not everyone has the luxury of pretending problems are small." Marcus met her gaze steadily. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. Instead, he simply reached for the towel again and wiped the last thin line of coffee from the counter with slow, careful movements. When he finished, he folded the towel once more and set it aside. Then he looked back at Victoria with the same quiet composure he had shown since the moment she walked in. "Everyone's problems are big to them," he said softly. "That is why kindness matters." The words were simple, almost too simple, yet something about the way he said them made the silence in the bakery deepen even further as Victoria Hale stood there, the untouched coffee cooling between them, unaware that this small moment in an ordinary bakery would soon connect to a night from her past that she had nearly forgotten. Victoria Hale stood still for another second after Marcus finished speaking, as if the sentence had landed somewhere she did not expect. "Everyone's problems are big to them. That is why kindness matters." The words were quiet, almost gentle, yet something about them felt stubbornly solid, like a simple truth that did not care how powerful someone was. Victoria did not respond. Instead, she picked up her phone, glanced at the growing list of notifications, and slid it back into her coat pocket with a controlled motion. The calm inside the bakery suddenly felt too slow for her schedule. She straightened her shoulders, turning slightly toward the door. "You should keep the money," she said, her voice cool again, but no longer sharp. "Consider it compensation for the trouble." Marcus glanced once more at the bills resting on the counter. He did not touch them. "The coffee costs $3.80, he replied gently. "Nothing more." Victoria gave a small shake of her head, almost impatient. "Then donate the rest to someone who needs it." Marcus did not argue further. He simply nodded once, accepting that the conversation had reached its end. Victoria stepped toward the door, her heels clicking softly against the tile floor. The bell above the entrance chimed when she pushed it open, letting in a breath of cool morning air from the street. Outside, the city was already moving at full speed. Traffic rolled through the intersection. A delivery truck rumbled past the corner. The quiet warmth of the bakery remained behind her as she stepped onto the sidewalk and immediately pulled her phone from her pocket again. 3 missed calls. 2 urgent messages. Her assistant's name at the top of the screen. Victoria pressed the call button while walking toward the black sedan waiting near the curb. Victoria, the assistant's voice answered quickly. We have been trying to reach you. The board wants an update before 10. Victoria opened the car door and slid into the back seat, her expression already shifting back into the controlled focus that defined most of her days. I saw the messages, she said calmly. Send me the revised numbers. I will review them during the drive. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the steady current of morning traffic. Within seconds, the bakery disappeared behind a row of storefronts and office buildings. Victoria leaned back in the leather seat, scanning the documents appearing on her screen while the city moved past the window in a blur of glass towers and busy sidewalks. The conversation from the bakery should have been forgotten already. Just another small moment in a long, demanding day. Yet as the car stopped briefly at a red light, something unexpected crossed her mind. Not the spilled coffee, not the quiet room, but the calm voice of the man behind the counter saying that kindness mattered. For a fraction of a second, the memory triggered another image buried deeper in her mind. A different morning months earlier. Colder air. A quiet jogging path near the edge of the city park. The feeling of dizziness that had come out of nowhere. Victoria frowned slightly, trying to catch the shape of the memory before it disappeared again. She could almost hear a voice from that day, steady and patient, telling her to stay awake and breathe slowly while someone called for help. The traffic light turned green and the car began moving again, carrying her deeper into the city. Victoria shook the thought away and returned her attention to the numbers glowing on the screen. Yet somewhere in the back of her mind, the quiet echo of that unfamiliar voice remained, waiting for a connection she had not yet realized was sitting behind the counter of a small neighborhood bakery. The black sedan carrying Victoria Hale moved steadily through downtown traffic while the morning city unfolded outside the tinted windows in a blur of steel, glass, and hurried pedestrians. Inside the car, the quiet hum of the engine mixed with the soft tapping of her fingers against the screen of her phone as she reviewed contracts and financial projections. Her assistant's voice continued through the speaker, outlining the newest complication with the distribution deal that had already consumed most of her morning. Victoria listened carefully, responding with precise decisions that came quickly, the way someone learns to think when thousands of employees and millions of dollars depend on clarity. Yet even as she worked, a small piece of her attention drifted somewhere else. The image of the bakery returned unexpectedly. The wooden counter, the warm smell of bread, the calm expression of Marcus Reed, as if the world moved slower inside his shop. She dismissed the thought at first. Moments like that happened every day in a city full of people crossing paths without meaning anything to each other. But when the car slowed again near another intersection, the earlier memory from the park pushed its way forward more clearly. It had been early in the morning months ago, colder than today, when she had gone running before a long flight to Chicago. She remembered the path winding through the quiet trees, the cold air in her lungs, and then the sudden wave of dizziness that made the world tilt sideways without warning. The memory felt incomplete, like a photograph missing its edges. She could recall sitting on the ground, her vision blurred, hearing a voice telling her to breathe slowly and stay awake while someone called for help. At the time, she had been too disoriented to focus on the person beside her. By the time the ambulance arrived, the man had already stepped away quietly into the background. Victoria had asked about him once later at the hospital, but no one had known his name. The memory had faded after that, replaced by meetings and travel and the constant motion of her career. Victoria, are you still there? Her assistant asked through the phone. Victoria blinked and returned her attention to the present. Yes, she said calmly. Send the updated numbers to my email. I will review them before the board meeting. The call ended a moment later, leaving the quiet interior of the car once again. Outside the window, the car passed a row of small neighborhood businesses. A laundromat, a barber shop, a corner grocery store. Ordinary places most executives never noticed while moving between office towers. Victoria rested her phone against her knee and looked out at the passing streets. Something about the bakery continued to linger in her thoughts, though she could not yet explain why. Perhaps it was the unusual calm of the man behind the counter. Perhaps it was the simple sentence about kindness that had refused to sound defensive even when she spoke sharply. Or perhaps it was the faint echo of that voice from months earlier on. The jogging path. The driver turned the car toward the financial district where the tallest buildings stood like quiet monuments to ambition and pressure. Victoria straightened slightly, preparing herself to step back into the pace of her normal world. Yet somewhere behind her, across several blocks of busy streets, a small bakery continued its quiet morning routine, while Marcus Reed swept a few crumbs from the floor and Lila returned to her math homework, neither of them knowing that the woman who had just left their shop was beginning to remember a moment when a stranger's calm voice had once helped her stay conscious on a cold morning she almost did not forget. The financial district rose around Victoria Hale like a forest of glass and steel, each building reflecting the morning sun in sharp, bright lines that seemed to promise power, control, and endless responsibility. By the time the black sedan reached the entrance of Hale Nutritional Foods headquarters, the quiet memory of the bakery had been pushed to the back of her mind by the steady rhythm of corporate life. Assistants greeted her in the lobby, screens glowed with financial reports, and the elevator carried her quickly to the executive floor where decisions never waited for long. For the next several hours, Victoria moved through meetings with the same focus that had built her reputation. Contracts were reviewed, strategies adjusted, and projections debated around a long polished table where every voice waited for her final word. Yet somewhere between one presentation and the next, the strange echo of that earlier memory returned again. It happened during a brief pause when the room grew quiet, and someone mentioned a health initiative the company was planning to sponsor in city parks later that year. The word city park drifted through Victoria's thoughts like a key turning slowly in an old lock. The image came back stronger this time. The early morning air months ago. The empty jogging path surrounded by tall trees. The sudden weakness that had forced her to sit down on the cold ground while the world spun around her. And then the voice. Calm. Steady. A man telling her to stay awake. Telling her help was coming. Victoria frowned slightly as the meeting continued around her. She could almost hear the tone of that voice again, patient and grounded, the way someone speaks when they are trying to keep another person from slipping into panic. She remembered asking once later at the hospital who had called the ambulance. The nurse had simply said a passerby had stayed with her until the paramedics arrived, but had not left a name. At the time, Victoria had accepted the answer and returned to her schedule. People helped strangers every day. It had seemed like a small moment in the middle of a busy life. But now the memory carried a new detail she had not noticed before. The rhythm of the voice. The calm steadiness. It sounded almost identical to the man behind the counter at the bakery that morning. Victoria shifted slightly in her chair as the realization brushed against her thoughts. The coincidence felt unlikely. Yet the more she replayed the memory in her mind, the clearer the connection seemed. When the meeting finally ended, the other executives gathered their papers while discussing the next agenda. Victoria remained seated for a moment longer than usual, her attention no longer on the spreadsheets in front of her, but on the quiet possibility forming in her mind. Could the stranger from the jogging path have been Marcus Reed? The idea lingered just long enough to change the direction of her afternoon. Because if the calm baker she had spoken to so sharply that morning was the same man who had once stayed beside her on a cold morning while she struggled to stay conscious, then the small argument over a cup of coffee suddenly carried a meaning far deeper than she had realized when she walked out of that quiet little shop. Victoria Hale remained seated at the long conference table after the room slowly emptied, the quiet hum of the city drifting through the tall glass windows behind her. For the first time that morning, the constant movement of her schedule paused long enough for one simple thought to settle clearly in her mind. The calm voice on the jogging path months ago, and the calm voice behind the bakery counter that morning sounded too similar to ignore. She replayed the memory again, more carefully this time. The cold air. The dizziness that had forced her to sit down. The steady presence of someone kneeling nearby, telling her to breathe slowly and stay awake while help was on the way. She remembered how that stranger had never asked for recognition, never stayed long enough to be thanked properly, and had disappeared quietly the moment the paramedics arrived. At the time she had assumed he was just another passerby who happened to notice someone in trouble. But now the memory felt different. The patience in his voice matched the patience she had heard earlier in the bakery. The same calm tone that had remained steady, even while she spoke sharply over something as small as a cup of coffee. Victoria stood up slowly from the table and walked toward the window overlooking the streets below. Far beneath her, the city moved with the same restless urgency she knew so well. Cars flowed through intersections. People hurried along sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. The world outside the tower never slowed down long enough to notice quiet moments of kindness. Yet the thought stayed with her. If Marcus Reed was the same man from that morning in the park, then the stranger who had once stayed beside her when she nearly collapsed had been standing calmly behind a wooden bakery counter while she questioned his understanding of real problems. The realization settled heavily, but not painfully. More like a quiet correction. Victoria reached for her phone and opened the map application. Her fingers hovered for a moment before typing the address she had glanced at briefly earlier that morning. Reed's Corner Bakery appeared on the screen only a few blocks from the edge of the neighborhood district. A small place surrounded by ordinary buildings, far from the towers where most of her work happened. She stared at the location for several seconds, remembering the warm smell of bread, the quiet customers, and the little girl watching carefully from her stool near the back wall. Marcus had never mentioned the park. He had never suggested that he recognized her. He had simply treated her like any other customer who walked through the door carrying too much stress. Victoria slipped the phone into her coat pocket again and took a slow breath while looking out over the city. In a world where power often demanded attention and recognition, the man behind that bakery counter had done something unusual. He had helped a stranger on a cold morning months ago and never expected anything in return. Then when that same stranger spoke to him with frustration over something small, he had answered with the same steady patience. Victoria turned away from the window and walked toward the door of the conference room, her decision forming quietly but clearly. Tomorrow morning the city would wake up the same way it always did, with traffic filling the streets and people rushing toward another long day. But somewhere between the tall buildings and the busy sidewalks, a small bakery would open its door again. And this time when Victoria Hale walked inside, she intended to listen more carefully to the calm voice of the man who had already changed her life once without ever saying so.